Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Finally back in her mountain home so dear, Heidi has to visit grandmother and go out to the pasture with the goats and listen to the music of the wind in the fir trees. But most of all, she enjoys spending time with grandfather, who has also been deeply affected by all that Heidi has learned in Frankfort. The lessons Heidi teaches him will change their lives for the better. Meanwhile, back in Frankfort, the Sesemann household is preparing for a journey, not for Clara, as she is not strong enough yet, but for the doctor, who is to visit Heidi and take love, greetings, and many packages for the residents of the little mountain meadow. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Heidi, Chapter 14. Sunday when the church bells ring. Heidi stood beneath the swaying boughs of the fir trees and waited for her grandfather, who was going along to get the trunk up from the hamlet, while she made a call on grandmother. The child was all eagerness to see grandmother again and to find out how the rolls had tasted, and yet the time did not seem long to her, for she could not tire of listening to the whispering voices of the firs, of drinking in the sweet odors and the brightness of the green meadows and their golden flowers. Grandfather came out of the hut at last, took a long look at the scene around him, and said contentedly, "Well, I guess we can go now." Today was Saturday, the time of all the week when it was Meadow Uncle's custom to clean the hut and put things to right in the shed and all around. He had taken the morning to do this, so he could make the trip with Heidi in the afternoon. That is why everything looked so neat. They parted at the door of Goat Peter's hut, and Heidi ran inside. The grandmother had already heard her coming, and she called out to her fondly, "Are you there, dear? Have you come to see us again?" Then she grasped Heidi's hand and squeezed it a little, for she was still afraid the child might be taken away from her again. And then grandmother had to tell how the rolls had tasted, and she said that they had strengthened her so that she was much better that day than she had been for a long time. Peter's mother added, however, that the old lady was much worried lest the rolls would disappear too soon, and so she could be persuaded to eat only one of them the day before and that day together. Goat Peter's mother thought she would gain in strength faster if she would agree to eat one roll a day for a whole week at a stretch. Heidi listened carefully to what Brigitte said, and she was very thoughtful for a little while. But then she had found a way out of the difficulty. "I know what we'll do, grandmother," she said with great eagerness. "I'll write to Clara, and she will be sure to send me as many rolls again, or perhaps even twice as many, for I had a great pile of such rolls hidden in my closet, and when they took them away from me, Clara said she'd give me just as many more, and she'll do what she said she would." "Oh, dear me," Brigitte said, "that is a fine idea. But they will be hard before they get here, don't you think? If only we had a spare penny now and then, we could get the rolls from the baker down in Dörfli. He has them for sale, but it's all I can do to pay for the black bread we eat." It was then that a bright ray of joy came into Heidi's face. "Oh, I've got a great lot of money, grandmother," she shouted gaily, and she couldn't stand still, she was so happy. "Now I know just what I'll do with it. Every single day you're to have a fresh roll, and 2 on Sunday. Peter can fetch them up from the hamlet." "Oh, no, my dear," the grandmother said. "That would never do. The money was not given to you for any such purpose. You must hand it to your grandfather. He'll tell you how to spend it." But Heidi would not have her nice plans spoiled. She crowed and danced around the room and kept calling, "Now grandmother's going to eat a roll every day and grow strong. And oh, grandmother," she cried out again in her delight, "when you get healthy, things will be bright for you again, surely. I think they're only dark because you're so weak." The grandmother kept silence, because she did not wish to spoil the child's happiness. While she was gaily dancing around, Heidi caught sight of grandmother's old hymn book, and she was suddenly struck with a bright idea. "Grandmother, do you know I can read nicely now? Shan't I just read you a song out of your old book?" "Oh, do," said the grandmother in a pleased surprise. "So you really can do that, can you?" Heidi had climbed up on a chair and taken down the book. It was covered with thick dust, for it had not been touched for a long time. She wiped it clean, sat down with it on the stool beside grandmother, and asked what she should read first. "Whatever you like best, dear," said the old lady very eagerly, pushing the spinning wheel away from her. Heidi turned over the leaves, reading here a line and there a line. "Oh, here's something about the sun. I'll read that, grandmother." And Heidi began in a low voice to spell out the words of the beautiful, comforting hymn. And as she read, she grew more eager, and her voice more full and warm. "Sun, golden gleaming, joyously beaming, brings to our regions thy countless legions of spirit-quickening, glorious rays. For long I stumbled, bowed down and humbled, but now arisen, with swift decision, turn I to heaven my enraptured gaze. I view impassioned what God has fashioned, to tell the story of his great glory, infinite, endless the tale of his might. All pious creatures see there his features, when happy-hearted they have departed from earth to bask in his heavenly light. Worldly things sever, God stays forever. There is no changing of his arranging. His word and will are eternal law. His grace and favor swerve not nor waver. They cure each breaking heart of its aching, filling our souls with a holy awe. Today we languish in grief and anguish, but all our sorrow shall fade tomorrow. After the storm, the sun shines bright. Sweet peace and pleasure, boundless in measure, we know are given in the garden of heaven. Thither my thoughts turn day and night." When she had finished, grandmother sat with folded hands, on her face a look of joy, such as Heidi had never seen there before, even if the tears were streaming down the aged cheeks. "Oh, Heidi," she said at last happily, "that hymn makes the world light for me, with its lines about the sun that shines in the garden of heaven. It makes my soul light indeed. Oh, how much good you have done me, my dear." Grandmother repeated the joyful words over and over. Heidi glowed with happiness and kept her eyes fixed on the old lady's face, for she had never seen her look so before. Grandmother's face no longer had its troubled look, but glanced up at her so brightly that it seemed as if she was already seeing with the glad eyes of faith the fair garden of heaven, of which the hymn sang. Then someone knocked at the window, and Heidi saw her grandfather beckoning her to go home with him. She went quickly, but not until she had given grandmother her promise to come again the next day. Even if she went back up to the pasture with Peter, she said that she would be back in the afternoon. It had become the dearest joy that Heidi knew, to make the world bright and joyful for grandmother, a joy much greater even than to be in the sunlit pasture with her flowers and her goats. Brigida ran out of the door after Heidi, carrying the dress and the hat which had been left behind, and Heidi took the dress to carry off with her, for she was now sure that grandfather would know her in the new costume. But the hat she stubbornly refused to accept. She told Brigitte to keep it for herself. She never wanted to put it on her head again. The child was so full of what had recently happened to her that right away she had to tell grandfather everything that was in her mind. She said they could get the white rolls for grandmother down in the hamlet if they had money enough. She said things had suddenly grown bright and happy for grandmother. And when Heidi had told her whole story down to the end, she went back to the beginning and said to him hopefully, "Listen, even if grandmother doesn't want me to, you'll give me all the money in the roll, won't you? So I can hand Peter a penny every day for a roll, and 2 on Sundays."
"But how about the new bed, Heidi?" grandfather said. "A real bed would be a fine thing for you, and there'd be enough money left to buy lots of rolls with."
Heidi gave her grandfather no peace, however. She proved to him that she slept better on her couch of straw than she had ever done in her feather bed in Frankfort. And she kept pleading with him so earnestly and constantly that he finally said,
"It's your money, Heidi, to do with as you please. You can get bread for grandmother with it for many a year."
Heidi called out happily, "Hooray! Now grandmother will never have to eat any more hard black bread. And oh, grandfather, things were never so splendid before in all our lives." She seized the old man's hand and jumped up and down as happy and free as the birds in the air. Then all at once she grew serious again and said, "Oh, suppose the dear God had done right on the spot what I had begged him so hard to do. Then things wouldn't have turned out as they have. I should have come home with only a few rolls for grandmother, and could not have read aloud to her, which does her so much good. But dear God had already planned it out so much better than I thought. Grandmamma said he would, and it has all come true. My, but I am glad the dear God did not give in to me when I prayed and made such a fuss. From now on, I'll pray as grandmamma told me to, and be grateful to the dear God even when he doesn't do what I ask, for I can always think, it's just as it was in Frankfort. Dear God is planning something much better for me. And now we'll pray every day, won't we, grandfather? And we'll never forget him, so the dear God will never forget us."
"But suppose one did not pray? What then?" muttered grandfather.
"Why, then he would not succeed, for the dear God would forget him too and leave him all alone. And when he got into trouble and complained, then nobody would pity him at all. They would say, 'He ran away from the dear God first, so now God, who could help him, doesn't pay any attention to him either.'"
"How true that is, Heidi! But who taught you that?"
"Grandmamma told me. She explained it all to me." The old gentleman walked up and down a while in silence. Then, following his own thought, he said to himself,
"Still, suppose that is the way of it. It's too late to go back afterward, and whom God has forgotten, he has forgotten."
"Oh, no, grandfather, it's never too late. Grandmamma told me about that too. Besides, the beautiful story in my book says the same thing. But I never read that one to you. We'll be home in a minute now, and then you'll just see how lovely the story is." In her mad hurry to be home, Heidi hurried faster and faster during the last of their climb, and scarcely had they reached the top when the child let go of grandfather's hand and flew into the cottage. The old gentleman took from his shoulders the basket, into which he had put half of the things that were in Heidi's trunk, for the whole trunk was too heavy for him to carry up all at once. He sat down on the bench and gave himself up to his thoughts. Heidi came running back to him with the book under her arm. "Oh, that's fine, grandfather, that you're sitting right there." With a bound, Heidi was at his side and had found her place in the book. She had read the story through so often that the book always opened at this page, and Heidi, with emotion, went on to read the saddest, gladdest story in all the world, the tale of the prodigal son. "Isn't that a beautiful story, though?" Heidi asked, as she finished it and closed her book. But grandfather made no reply to the question. She had expected him to be surprised and glad, instead of which he sat in silence and seemed not to hear her.
"Yes, Heidi, the story is indeed beautiful," Grandfather said after a long pause.
But his face was so solemn that Heidi grew very quiet and opened her book to look at its pictures. Gently she pushed the book in front of Grandfather and said, "See how happy he is." Heidi pointed with her finger to the picture of the prodigal's return home, where he is standing in fresh garments beside his father, and once more belongs to him as his son. A few hours later, when Heidi had long been fast asleep, Grandfather climbed up the small ladder. He put his lantern down beside the child's bed, so that its rays fell on her sleeping form. She lay before him with her hands clasped, for she had not forgotten to pray. On her little pink face there was a look of peacefulness and happy trust, which gave its own message to Grandfather. He stood there a long time without moving, with his eyes fixed on the sleeping child. Then he too clasped his hands together, and with bowed head he whispered, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son." And 2 great tears ran down the old man's cheeks. Not many hours after this scene, in the early hour of dawn, Meadow Nuncle was standing in front of his hut and looking around him with shining eyes. The Sabbath light glistened and beamed above mountain and valley. Single notes from the early chiming of church bells stole up from the lands far below, and high above in the pine trees the birds were singing their morning songs. Then Grandfather stepped back into the hut. "Come, Heidi," he called up into the loft. "Here's the sun. Put on a pretty dress and we'll go to church together." It did not take Heidi long to dress. There was a new note in Grandfather's voice which made her eager to obey. In a short time she came hurrying down, with her dainty Frankfort dress on, but she stopped in front of Grandfather and gazed at him unbelievingly. "Why, I never saw you look that way," she broke out at last. "That's the first time you've worn your coat with the silver buttons. Oh, you're so handsome in your fine Sunday clothes." The old gentleman looked down at the child with an amused smile and said, "So are you, my dear, and now let's start." He took Heidi's hand in his, and together they wandered down the mountain path. They could now hear the clear church bells ringing on all sides of them, their tones growing deeper and sweeter the nearer they drew to them. Heidi listened blissfully and said, "Do you hear them, Grandfather? It's like some big festival." Down below in Dörfli, all the people were already in church, and were just beginning to sing a hymn as Grandfather and Heidi came in and sat down, far back in the last pew. But right in the midst of the singing, the person who sat next to them nudged his neighbor with his elbow and said, "Have you noticed? Meadow Nuncle's in church." And the neighbor nudged the next one to him, and so on and on. In the shortest time imaginable, the news was being whispered in every nook and corner. "It's Meadow Nuncle. Do you see Meadow Nuncle?" Almost all the women had to turn around and gaze for a moment, and most of them got behind in the tune, and the leader of the singing had the greatest difficulty in keeping time at all. But the moment the pastor began to preach, they paid strict attention, for his sermon contained such warm words of praise and thanksgiving that all his listeners were very happy. It seemed as if a new joy had come into every heart. When the service had ended, Meadow Nuncle walked out, holding Heidi's hand in his, and went toward the parsonage. All the worshippers who came out with him, and those who were already standing outside the church, stared after him, and they followed behind a little way to see if he was really going into the manse. He did so. Then they gathered about in small groups and excitedly spoke of this unheard-of thing, that Meadow Nuncle had come to church, and they kept their gaze fixed on the entrance of the parsonage to see how he would next appear. Would he come out in anger and at strife with the world, or would he have made his peace with the pasture? None could guess which it would be, for the simple reason that nobody knew what had brought the old gentleman down the mountain, or what his coming meant. But it was easy to see that there was already a change of feeling in the hearts of many of the churchgoers, for one would say to the other, "It may well be that Meadow-Nuncle is not so bad as he is painted. You can tell by the way he holds the little one's hand, he's so careful." And the other would answer, "That's just what I always said, you remember, and he wouldn't be going to call on the pastor if he was so terribly bad. He'd be afraid to. People always exaggerate such things." But the baker, who had driven Heidi up from Mayenfeld, said, "That's what I've been claiming from the first. Since when does a little child that has everything it wants to eat and drink and all sorts of good things beside run away from its fine home and go back to its grandfather, if that grandfather is wicked and wild and a man to fear?" A very tender feeling for Meadow-Nuncle was now shown by the men, and this increased when the women joined them, for they had heard from the lips of Goat Peter's mother and grandmother many things that went to prove Meadow-Nuncle was quite a different sort of man from what people usually thought him to be. And this good opinion grew until all at once it seemed as if they were all waiting there outside the manse to welcome back into the fold an old friend whose absence they had long been sorry for. In the meantime, Meadow-Nuncle had gone to the pastor's study door and knocked upon it. The preacher himself opened the door and met his callers, not with the surprise that was to be expected, but as if he had awaited their coming. The pastor, of course, could not help but know that grandfather had been to church. He seized the old gentleman's hand and shook it again and again, but Meadow-Nuncle stood before him silently, and could not find a single word to say, for he had not expected so friendly a greeting. At last, however, he said, "I have come, pastor, to ask you to forget the words I said to you last year up on the mountain meadow. Also to beg you not to be angry with me for being stubborn and not listening to your sensible advice. You were right in everything you said, pastor, and I was wrong. But I'm going to follow your advice now, if it is not too late, and take up quarters here in the hamlet this winter, for the child is too delicate to endure the severe weather above. And even if the people down here look sideways at me, because they do not trust me, why, I do not deserve any better treatment. But I know, pastor, that you will not treat me so." The fine eyes of the pastor shone with joy. He took the old gentleman's hand, pressed it in his own, and said with feeling, "Neighbor, you went to the right church before you came down to visit mine. Thank God for that, and you won't be sorry if you come back to live among us. You will always be a dear friend and neighbor to me, and I look forward to spending many a happy evening with you this winter, for I enjoy your society very much, and the little girl will find good friends too." The pastor laid a very friendly hand on Heidi's curly head, and then he took her hand in his to lead her outside, as he walked along with her grandfather, and not until they were in front of the parsonage did he say good-bye to them. So it came about that all the people who were standing there saw the preacher shaking hands with Meadow-Nuncle, quite as if he were his best friend and could hardly bear to part with him. And when the door of the manse had scarcely closed behind the pastor, the whole gathering crowded up to Meadow-Nuncle, and each one seemed to wish to be the first to welcome him. In fact, so many hands were held out to him at the same instant that he did not know which to take first. One said to him, "I'm so pleased, Nuncle, that you're coming back to be with us again." Another said to him, "I've been waiting for this long time to talk with you again, Nuncle." Such things were being said on every side, and when to their friendly words of greeting, Nuncle answered that he had decided to take up his old quarters in the hamlet, to pass the winter there with his old friends. Then there was excitement. You would have thought indeed that Meadow-Nuncle was the most popular fellow in all Dörfli, and that they had had a terrible time in getting along without him. Most of his newfound friends walked with grandfather and the little child far up the pasture slopes, and before they left him, each one wished to make Meadow-Nuncle promise to pay him a call after he had moved down. When at last the people turned to go down the mountain, the old man stood and gazed after them a long time. A warm light rested on his face, as if some inner sun was shining through. Heidi looked at him steadily and said with joy, "Grandfather, never in your life did you look so handsome as you have today."
"Do you really think so?" asked Grandfather with a smile. "Well, you see, Heidi, I am better off than I deserve to be, and I am at peace with God and men, and that makes one feel so happy. The dear God was good to me the day he sent you to the mountain meadow."
When they got as far as Peter the goatherd's hut, Grandfather straightway opened the door and went in.
"God greet you, Grandmother," he called out. "I think we must get to patching again before the autumn winds blow."
"Why, heaven above, that's Nuncle!" cried the old lady in joyful surprise. "That I should live to see this day! I can thank you now for all you've done for us, Nuncle. May God reward you." Trembling with happiness, the old grandmother held out her hand, and after her visitor had given it a hearty shake, she still clung to his hand and went on to say, "There's another thing in my heart to ask of you, Nuncle. If I have ever done anything to hurt you, then don't punish me by letting Heidi go away before I lie down in my grave in the churchyard. Oh, you don't know what the child is to me." And she drew Heidi close to her and hugged her tightly.
"Don't worry, Grandmother," Nuncle said soothingly. "I'll punish neither you nor myself in that way. We're all going to stick together now, and if God so wills, for a long time to come."
Then Brigida drew Nuncle secretly off to a corner of the room and showed him the pretty hat trimmed with feathers, and told him how it came to be there, and said she of course would not accept such a gift from the child. But Grandfather, well pleased, looked in Heidi's direction and said,
"The hat is hers, and if she doesn't want to wear it on her head, she doesn't need to. And if she gave it to you, take it."
Brigida was greatly pleased at this decision, which she had not expected. She said, It's certainly worth more than 10 francs. Just look at it." In her joy she held the hat high for his inspection. What real blessings this Heidi has brought back from Frankfort with her. I've been thinking whether I ought not to send Peterly to Frankfort for a little while too. What do you say, Nuncle? Grandfather's eyes twinkled brightly. He said, in his opinion, it could not do Peter any harm, but he would wait until there was a good chance for him to go. And then the person they were talking about came in the door. But first he banged his head against it so hard that it made everything rattle. He seemed to be in a tearing hurry. Out of breath and panting, he now stood in the middle of the room and held out a letter. That was a thing that had never happened before. A letter which they had given him in the Dörfli post office to deliver. They all sat down around the table, and Heidi opened her letter and read it out loud, without making a single mistake. The letter had been written by Clara Sesemann. She said in it that since Heidi had gone away, the house had grown so dreary that she couldn't bear it, and she had begged her father so long that he had finally agreed to make the trip to the baths at Ragaz the coming autumn. And Grandmamma would come with them too, for she wanted to visit Heidi and Grandfather up on the mountain meadow. And further, Clara wrote, that Grandmamma had asked her to tell Heidi that she had done right in wishing to take the rolls to Grandmother, and so the old lady would not have to eat them dry. She was sending along some coffee, which had already started on its way, and when she came to the mountain meadow, Heidi must take her to pay a visit to Grandmother. Then there was such joy and surprise at this news, and such a world of things to talk about and ask, because all of them were interested in what was going to happen. And Grandfather himself did not notice how late it had grown. They were all so happy to think of the days that were coming, and almost more contented at being together on this very day, that grandmother finally said,
"But the nicest thing of all is for an old friend to come and give us his hand again, just as he used to long ago. It's such a comfortable feeling to have in one's heart, to realize that we have found everything again that is dear to us. You'll come soon, won't you, Nuncle? And you, Heidi, tomorrow?"
They gave their promise to grandmother at once, and now it was time to go. Grandfather wandered with Heidi up to the mountain pasture, and just as that morning the clear bells from near and far had called them down into the hamlet, so now the peaceful ringing of the evening chimes gave them company on their way to the sunlit meadow hut, which smiled its welcome in the Sunday evening light. Chapter 15. Preparations for a Journey. The kind doctor who had insisted that Heidi be sent back to her home was walking down Broad Street toward the Sesemanns. It was a sunny morning in September, so clear and lovely that you would think anyone would find joy in it. But the doctor was staring so hard at the stone sidewalk beneath his feet that he never once noticed the blue sky above him. There was a sadness on his face which had not been there in former days, and since the first of the year his hair had grown much more gray. The doctor had had an only daughter, and after his wife's death she had come to mean everything to him, to be the one great happiness of his life. But some months before this, the girl, whose youth was just beginning, also had been taken from him by death, and from that time on, the doctor had never again seemed the light-hearted man of earlier years. He climbed the steps that led to the handsome Sesemann house and rang the bell. Hardly had the sound of its ringing stopped when Sebastian opened the door, and the moment he saw who was waiting outside, he was very polite and respectful in his manner. This was not only because the doctor was the best friend of the master of the house and of his sick little daughter, but here, as everywhere, he had by his kindness of heart won the goodwill of the whole household.
"Everything going along all right, Sebastian?"
the doctor asked in his usual friendly tone. He mounted the stairs that led to the second floor, followed by the butler, who was still bowing and scraping most devotedly, although the doctor of course did not know this, as his back was turned.
"It's a good thing you came, Doctor," Mr. Sesemann greeted him. "We must talk over that trip to Switzerland once more. I want to know if you still think it necessary for us to give it up, now that Clara's health has taken a turn for the better." "My dear Sesemann, what on earth am I to think of you?" the doctor replied, taking a seat beside his friend. "I'd give a good deal if your mother were here. It's always straight sailing with her from the word go. But there's no getting along with you at all. This is the third time in one day that you've sent for me, so that I can have the pleasure of saying the same thing over again."
Mr. Sesemann laid his hand almost humbly on the doctor's shoulder.
"Yes, I know you are right, and the matter must make you impatient. But, dear friend, I do want you to understand how hard it is for me to deny the child what I promised her so definitely, and what has made her so happy day and night for months." "Hard for you," said the doctor. "But after all, does that change anything?" "Oh, perhaps not. But don't you remember how patient the poor child has been during all those recent days, always hoping that the Swiss journey was to be soon, and that she could visit her little friend Heidi in the Alps? And now, after the child has had to give up so much happiness, you ask me to destroy at a single blow the hope that she has lived on for so long? Oh, I tell you, it is not possible." "Sesemann, you must," the doctor said decidedly.
And then when he saw his friend sat in silence and looking quite wretched, he went on to say after a pause,
"Just think how the matter stands. For years, Clara has not had so bad a summer as this last one has been. There's no question of her taking so long a journey without the greatest danger to her health. Besides, it's now the month of September. It may still be fine weather in the Alps, but it will certainly be cold up there by now. At night, yes, but perhaps during the day? Ah, but the days are growing short, and as Clara can't stay overnight on the mountain, but would have to live elsewhere, she would have altogether a bare 2 hours to be up there. It's a trip of some hours up the mountain, especially as she would have to be carried up in a chair. To make a long story short, Sesemann, it can't be thought of. Oh, what will poor Clara say? Oh, we'll go in and talk with her about it. She's a sensible girl, and I'll tell her what my plan is. Next May, say, she can go to Ragaz and take the baths there for some time, until the weather is fine and warm in the Alps. Then she can be carried up every once in a while, and after she has got back her strength somewhat, she will enjoy these mountain trips twice as much as she would now. I suppose you know, Sesemann, if we want to have the slightest hope of your child's getting well again, we must use the greatest care and treat her very tenderly."
Mr. Sesemann, who had been listening quietly and with much attention to these last words, suddenly jumped to his feet.
"Doctor, be honest with me. Have you the least hope that Clara will get well?"
The doctor shrugged his shoulders sadly.
"Not much," he said softly. "But come, my dear fellow, think of me for a moment. You have a dear child who longs for you when you are away from home, and is happy when you come back. You never have to return to an empty house and sit down to a lonely dinner. Your child is well cared for at home. It is true she must go without many things that other children have, and yet in some ways she's more spoiled than they are. No, Sesemann, you and Clara are not to be so greatly pitied. You are fortunate to have each other. But think of my lonely house."
Mr. Sesemann was striding up and down the room, as he always did when he was thinking deeply of some matter. Then suddenly he came to a stop, and tapped his friend on the shoulder.
"Doctor, I have an idea. I can't bear to see you like this. You're not the man you used to be. You must get away for a while from your own thoughts. And do you know how to do that? You go to Switzerland in our place, and visit Heidi."
The doctor was very much surprised at this offer, and would not have consented to it if Mr. Sesemann had given him time to object. But the master of the house was so delighted with his new idea that he took his friend's arm and marched him over to the room of his small daughter. The doctor was always a great favorite of the sick girl, because he always treated her so nicely, and every time he came, he had some funny story or another to tell her. She knew, of course, why he was no longer as lively as he used to be, and she did wish with all her heart that she could think of some way to make him happy again. She stretched out her hand the minute he came in and sat down beside her. Her father also drew his chair up to the bedside, and with her hand in his, began to talk about the Swiss journey and the joy with which he had looked forward to it. He passed quickly over the fact that the trip was now out of the question, for he was afraid of the tears that were coming. Then he went on to tell of the new plan, and showed Clara how great a help it would be to their dear friend to have this short vacation. True enough, the tears did come and swam in Clara's blue eyes, try as she would to hold them back, for she knew that Papa hated to see her cry. But oh, it was hard to give it all up now, when her only joy and comfort during the long, lonely hours of the past summer had been looking forward to her visit with Heidi. Clara never questioned what her father did, and she knew, of course, that he was asking her to give up the trip because it would be bad for her, and so she must not go. She choked down her sobs and turned to the only hope that was left to her. She took her good friend's hand and stroked it and said, "Oh, you will go to see Heidi, won't you, doctor? Then you can come back and tell me how things are in her mountain, and what she's doing, and her grandfather and Peter and the goats. They're all such friends of mine. And you can take the things I want to send Heidi and grandmother. I've got them all thought out. Please, Doctor, do go. And while you're gone, I promise to take all the cod liver oil you want me to, honest." It is hard to say whether this promise of Clara's decided the matter or not, but it seemed to do so, for the doctor smiled and said, "Then I certainly shall have to, little Clara. So you'll get plump and strong, as Papa and I want you to be. Have you decided when I must start?" "First thing tomorrow morning would be best," Clara answered. "Clara is right, so it would," her father chimed in. "The sun is shining, the sky is blue, and there's not a moment to be lost, for it is a shame not to be enjoying every such day in the Alps." The doctor had to laugh a little. "In a minute you'll be telling me, Sesemann, that it's my fault I'm not already at Heidi's house. So I'd better hurry away as fast as I can," he said. The doctor rose to go, but Clara held him fast. First, you see, there were so many things he had to tell Heidi for her. Then there were all the things he had to pay special attention to, so he could tell her about them afterward. She would send over later what she wanted him to take to Heidi, for Miss Rottenmeier would have to help her with the packing, and the housekeeper was off on one of her shopping tours in town, and might not be back right away. The doctor promised to do everything just as she told him to do. He would start on his journey, if not the first thing tomorrow, at least in the course of the following day. And when he returned, he would give her an exact account of everything he had seen and done. Servants in a house often have a wonderful way of finding out what is going on about them long before anyone thinks to tell them about it. Sebastian and Tinette must have had this gift of discovering things quickly, for hardly had the doctor, accompanied by Sebastian, reached the staircase when Tinette came into Clara's room, this in spite of the fact that she had been rung for only a second before. "Bring me this box full of nice fresh cakes, like those we have for coffee, Tinette," said Clara, pointing to a little chest, which had been standing there for just this purpose a long time. The maid seized the object by one corner and let it dangle carelessly from her hand. After she had shut the door behind her, she said snippily, "Little things like that are no trouble at all." When Sebastian had opened the front door with his usual politeness, he said with a bow, "I hope you will not forget to give little Mamselle my best wishes, doctor." "Why, look here, Sebastian," the doctor asked pleasantly. "How did you find out about my trip so soon?" The butler coughed slightly. I don't quite know myself. Oh yes, now I remember. I just happened to be going by the dining room a minute ago, and heard the little Mamselle's name mentioned. And as one does in such a case, you know, I put this and that together, and that's the way." "Of course," the doctor said with a smile, "and the more you put this and that together, the more you know. Goodbye, Sebastian. I'll deliver your message." The doctor had just passed through the opened entrance door when he met with a surprise. The high wind that was blowing had kept Miss Rottenmeier from continuing on her shopping tour, so she had returned and was on the point of coming in. The wind had puffed out the big shawl in which she was wrapped until she looked like a ship under full sail. The doctor moved back at once to make room for her. But Miss Rottenmeier had always shown a marked respect and politeness for this man of medicine, and she too on her side drew back for him to pass. For a time the two stood facing each other, each waiting for the other to go through first. Finally, such a strong gust of wind came along that the housekeeper, with all sails spread, was blown straight against the doctor. He just managed to give her room to pass, and the good lady was borne by the wind quite a way beyond him, so that she had to come back in order to greet in proper form the guest of the house. This flying on the wings of the wind had put her in a bad humor, but the doctor had a way all his own of soothing her ruffled temper and making her good-natured again. He told her about his intended trip and asked her in his most gracious manner if she would not pack for him the things that were going to Heidi, as only she knew how to pack them. With this bit of flattery, the doctor went away. Clara fully expected to have a struggle with Miss Rottenmeier before she would consent to give away all the things which were intended for Heidi. But for once she was pleasantly disappointed, for the housekeeper was in the best of tempers. She at once took everything off the large table, so she could spread out on it all the objects that Clara had gathered together, and pack them where the invalid could watch. This was no light task, since the articles that had to be wrapped up were of all different shapes. First came the small, thick cape with the hood, which Clara had chosen for Heidi, so that the next winter she could visit grandmother whenever she wanted, and not have to wait until her grandfather could come and wrap her up in the sack, to keep her from freezing. Then came a thick, warm shawl for grandmother, so she could wind it around her and not have to freeze when the wind should again begin to rattle at the hut so dreadfully. Then followed the big box of cakes, also intended for grandmother, so that she might once in a while have something else than a roll to eat with her coffee. Next in order came an enormous sausage. Clara had first meant this gift for Peter, because he never got anything but bread and cheese, which must be tiresome. But later she changed her mind because she was so afraid that Peter would like the sausage so much that he would devour it at a single meal. So his mother Brigida was to have it, and first cut off a big piece of it for herself and for grandmother, and then she was to serve Peter his share at different times, as she thought best. Then there was a small sack of tobacco for grandfather, who was so fond of smoking his pipe when he sat out in front of his hut of an evening. Last of all, there was a number of mysterious sacks, packages, and boxes, which Clara had especially enjoyed collecting, because Heidi was going to find in them all sorts of surprises which would make her very happy. Finally the work was ended, and a large bundle lay on the floor ready for the journey. Miss Rottenmeier looked down at it, and her mind was full of deep thoughts about the art of packing bundles well. Clara, for her part, could hardly keep her eyes from it, for her mind was dwelling on how Heidi would jump in the air and shout with joy when the enormous package should arrive. Then Sebastian came in, and with a mighty swing of his arms, he lifted the heavy bundle to his shoulder, so that he could send it at once to the doctor's house. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to Heidi. I'd love to hear your suggestions for future stories, so please send an email to me at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.